It's inspiring to me to be in a room with people who are so interested in building a better Canada. And you know, in troubled times like the ones we're living in today, it may seem pretty hard to find inspiration, but I think it can be found if you know where to look. For me, I'm still moved when I think about the Canadian women's soccer team winning the gold medal at the Olympics this summer. There was a lot of cheering in my house when the final goal went into the net, and it's not just that particular win. It's the uphill climb that team must have had since they had their Olympic debut, which was in 1996, to finally succeed. And knowing that is just inspiring so many young Canadians to aim high. And it didn't just happen. It didn't just happen by magic or luck. It took ambition, it took teamwork, it took a plan. And so, you know, it says to me, well, is there anything that we can use from this to apply to our troubled times? Because even as we see light at the end of the tunnel, it still feels like an uphill climb as the pandemic continues to take a toll. We know worldwide that around 5 million people have been reported to have lost their lives. 28,000 or over 28,000 now of those people were Canadians. We're beginning to learn about the scarring effects of the pandemic on people's physical and mental health. And the economic toll, let's face it, it's been immense. In the spring of 2020, Canadian GDP fell by the largest amount on record, and the employment losses were also huge. They were triple the size of employment losses that we saw over the 3 past recessions combined. And those job losses hit everybody, but they hit women, Indigenous people, youth, and vulnerable groups the hardest. And because of that, the governments took unprecedented and necessary actions to cushion the blow. So what we're seeing now is a recovery that's actually been pretty sharp, and that's good news. But we still haven't returned to the level of economic activity that we had before the pandemic. And at the same time, as we've all probably witnessed, ongoing issues with supply chains and labor shortages in some areas are creating headwinds to growth. Now, as we exit the pandemic, we're going to need to turn our attention to the challenges that we'll face ahead. We're getting older. Aging will continue to weigh on the growth that we have, and it will also increase the healthcare needs, even if it sparks some innovative responses. We're facing the reality of climate change. Climate change presents compelling opportunities, perhaps, but a massive effort will be needed to meet our goals, especially given that the cost of the transition that we're going to go through are going to fall unevenly across provinces and across sectors. And I think that we're not making the most of new technology. The challenge here will be to see that innovation is commercialized and broadly adopted here at home, and this is key, that the rewards are widely shared. So today what I'd like to do is discuss why the right kind of growth is critical to overcoming these challenges. For me, the key to success is to shift our focus towards targeted, long-term investments in people and in businesses and infrastructure, modern governance. Now, unfortunately, our track record on the growth front hasn't been that positive. It's been a bit underwhelming, to be frank, and this makes us vulnerable. When we look at the 10 years prior to COVID-19, the Canadian GDP growth averaged about 2.25% per year. That's not too bad. It's near the top of the pack of G7 countries. However, GDP per person, which is where you want to start when you think about our prosperity, was pretty slow. In fact, it averaged only about 1% per year. That's near the bottom of the pack, the G7 pack, and it's not even worth a bronze medal. Almost all of the gains in the GDP per capita that we saw have gone to those in the top part of the income distribution. The reality is we're going to need to go for gold to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth. We're going to need a game plan. We're going to need to adapt to circumstances. And we're going to execute with determination and teamwork. When I participated in the roundtable discussions that were mentioned earlier ahead of this summit, people spoke about a lot of things that they had on their mind and that they aspired to for us. There were good health, business success, meaningful work, affordable housing, welcoming communities, clean water, access to good education, and a healthy planet. Now, the concept of economic growth can sometimes seem very remote to these very human desires. It's just a number. It's not something that, well, at least I don't know about you, but I don't feel it in my heart. But our very well-being requires a variety of goods and services, both public and private. This is not about consumption without purpose or conspicuous consumption. It's about basic internet connections, teachers, medical equipment, elder care workers. It requires a talented workforce, competitive businesses, and considerable public and private investment. Just think about what went into the discovery of and commercialization of canola and insulin. Those are both Canadian inventions. Trade is also vital to our economic health. 1 in every $3 of Canadian national income comes from selling our products to the world. All of this has been the driving force that has made Canada among the globe's most advanced economies. So I'm going to say however, and it's a big however. Canada has been falling behind many of its peers in terms of growth per person because of weak productivity. The reasons are many. They include the slow pace of research and development and adoption of productivity-enhancing technologies, impediments to trade within Canada. We hear a lot about those. And also the loss of leading businesses to our friends south of the border. But what does this weak productivity performance mean for Canadian families? I was on a Zoom with my son last night, and he asked me that. Why should I care about productivity? Well, weak productivity performance diminishes our power to help ourselves financially and to help those in need. It diminishes our capacity to invest in Canada's future, and it diminishes our ability to keep public finances on a sustainable track. So, financial resources are critical. Anybody who's been in a business knows you need financial resources. But we also need an executable plan. I learned from many years of, mostly in Basel, working on international financial reform, often with about 50 people around the table, that building successful plans among diverse stakeholders, it isn't easy. Even around my own kitchen table, there's often more opinions than there are people. But the one big positive starting point for any discussion, aside from goodwill to listen and be there, is really to be honest about the hard lessons that we need to learn from the past. And so as we discuss over the next 2 days what a plan might look like, I think we need to learn some of those lessons. And I'm going to mention 3 that I think we should learn. And the first is that market forces, they are essential, but they don't always support the common good. An over-reliance on market forces has contributed to the global financial crisis in 2008 and to making wealth inequality worse. And given that individuals and businesses don't pay the full cost of their contribution to greenhouse gases and to pollution, market forces have aggravated the climate situation. Now, there is a renewed interest in examining how the public sector can set the context to enable the private sector to do what it does best, all with an aim to enhancing the public good. The second lesson in my mind is that the most efficient solutions may not be the best. Modern supply chains may be efficient, but they are vulnerable to costly disruptions, and we're seeing that today. Many of the materials that are needed for electric vehicles, part of our greening plan, are dependent on jurisdictions that are exposed to geopolitical risk, that have weak labor standards. And while it's neither practical nor advisable to try to become completely self-sufficient, there are opportunities here to build domestic capacity. We've seen efforts that have already begun to build back pharmaceutical capacity in Canada, and also to capitalize on our wealth of metals and critical minerals by investing in manufacturing capacity for high-performance batteries. And the final lesson is that inequality and lack of opportunity torpedoes progress. It really does. The research is clear. Economies that are more unequal, they have less healthy communities. They often experience lower growth, and they often experience less resilient growth. And I'm really looking forward to the sessions later today on overcoming barriers to opportunities and solutions to social challenges. These are economic policies. Now, the good news, and it's already been mentioned, is that we're not starting from scratch when it comes to a game plan. Anne was mentioning three different reports that are already out there that are worth a look. And given that Canada isn't alone in the world, I would suggest that you also look at a recent report by the G7 panel on economic resilience about how Canada can work with its G7 partners to build a more resilient economy. Now, the range of issues covered in these reports, it's immense. And it's immense for good reason. There are a lot of issues out there. But just allow me to look briefly at the three that I've already mentioned. Now, the first is aging of the population. It'll be expensive. Right now, about 1 in every 5 people in Canada are 65 or over. And this has increased the urgency of re-examining our healthcare strategies. It has profound implications for everything from aging in place strategies to the nature of healthcare services that we want to provide to the kind of healthcare workers that we're going to need. Now, robust and sustainable growth is essential to finance the investment that's needed for this transition. Already, healthcare services make up about 11.5% of our national income, and there's going to be pressure for that number to grow. Now, fortunately, we're already witnessing innovative responses to this challenge. One of them that I think is particularly important is adopting new technologies to increase the reach of healthcare services to remote communities. Now, this brings me to my second issue, which is technological advancement. We know that well before COVID, technology was transforming all sectors of the economy. I happen to like to think of the agricultural example because when I was a kid, about 100 years ago, we used to pick bales of hay off the fields, we'd throw them in the back of a wagon, and then we'd stack them up in the barn. Well, now the agricultural sector is a precision operation with robots, temperature sensors, and satellite images. And if we look back, broader than agriculture and over a longer period of time, what we'll find is that adopting better ways of doing business have given us a 20-fold increase in real income per capita in Canada since Confederation. 20-fold. Now, digital economic activities already make up about the same share of GDP in Canada as mining, oil, and gas combined. And the push to develop and adapt technology has only been accelerated by COVID. Now, many Canadian businesses have transformed themselves. Possibly some business people in the room have been part of this, or those listening in. And, from my perspective, what I've seen is they've adopted digital commerce. They've moved to remote work practices in a way that seems to be at the speed of light. And I think that this new momentum in the adoption of new technologies and business models could be a game changer for us if we lean into it. It would grow the size of the pie and lift rates of return to make long-term investment look a bit more attractive. Now, this argument that I'm giving you here about productivity may seem pretty familiar, but what's new, and there's a growing consensus about this, is that it can no longer just be about the size of the pie. Adoption of new technologies must aim to improve our collective well-being and not just benefit the few. FinTech, one of my favorite topics, is finding ways to increase access to financial services while reducing the cost to consumers. Canadian expertise in artificial intelligence is helping to enable everything from drug discovery to supply chain management. So what is it going to take from all of us to achieve shared benefits of innovation? Well, at a minimum, it's going to take considerable public and private investment. After the first central power station opened in the 1880s, way back when, electrification took several decades to have an impact on productivity in the United States. Why is that? Well, it's because power grids had to be built, machines had to be replaced. Innovation may be happening at a faster pace these days, but it doesn't change the practical side of implementation. It doesn't happen with a wave of a wand. Just think about 5G. It's not going to happen without major investments to upgrade networks. More broadly, we're going to need to invest more in research and development and in commercialization. It'll also take investment in education and training and modernization of competition policy and digital governance. And that's because technological advances can leave some people behind. In the first wave of information technology, when I was in high school, educated professionals could use their skills more productively, while others saw their jobs being replaced completely by technology. And sometimes types of technology also lead to market concentration and also to the rise of what some people have called superstar firms. And these superstar firms, including the modern digital giants, tend to have fewer employees than conventional companies and can earn pretty impressive monopoly profits. We think back, we've seen it before. We saw it with steel and railroads in the late 19th century. Now, Professor Romer, a world expert on what drives growth and productivity, is going to speak about this tomorrow. So I'm going to turn to my third and most urgent issue, climate change. Today's environmental risks represent the greatest intergenerational threat to our collective well-being. That's just the way it is. The planet is getting hotter. It's bringing with it increased risks of drought and crop failures, deadly and destructive storms and wildfires, and rising ocean levels that threaten to submerge entire communities. That's why Canada and many other countries signed on to the Paris Agreement to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And Prime Minister Trudeau has also set an interim goal, pledging to cut emissions by as much as 45% relative to the 2005 levels by 2030. And as we head into COP26, we're seeing many Canadian companies making their own ambitious commitments too. So achieving these goals will require major investments in many areas. A recent report by a major Canadian bank called this the 2 trillion transition. 2 trillion transition. So technological breakthroughs could lower the cost of transition, but it's a monumental endeavor that will require not only financial resources, but also a clear plan and sustained efforts from the public and private sectors. We're going to need to build out Canada's green grid to provide clean energy needed to power electric vehicles. We'll need to retrofit buildings and houses and to help agriculture green its practices. We're also going to need to reduce the carbon intensity of Canadian oil and gas production, particularly given the magnitude of emissions in this sector and the fact that we will still need fossil fuels for some years to come. This is within our reach. New opportunities are already being seized by Canadian companies, from developing carbon capture and storing capabilities to applying deep learning to cut energy waste in commercial buildings, and to the more sophisticated use of data in planting and harvesting crops. We're going to hear more tomorrow about the strategies Canada should adopt to meet climate change. So I see that the game clock is winding down on my remarks, so I'm going to conclude. Growth, and I'm going to say it really clearly, the right kind of growth is an essential ingredient to our shared objectives. To achieve this growth, we're going to need to recognize the power of public and private sectors to work together, new kinds of relationships, like was mentioned earlier, to shape the economy for the common good. We need to focus on long-term investments in areas like education and health, globally competitive businesses, our green power grid, and modern digital governance. Now, these investments will help equip us to build a strong, resilient, and inclusive economy that will serve us well as we seek to meet our climate objectives. Christine Sinclair, who's the captain of the Canadian Olympic soccer team, said something to me that really stuck in my mind. She said, "I think the thing that has sort of always separated me is my ability to score goals." Well, with 188 goals in her career, she certainly wasn't kidding. Canada needs to score more goals if we want to win the gold. And I think we're up for it. Like the women's soccer team, it'll take ambition. It'll take an executable plan with the right financial resources. And above all, it's going to take determined effort from the whole team. And that team includes you. All right.
So you're talking about the team approach, and it occurs to me we've just been through an experience in the country where, for a little while anyway, partisanship sort of took a back seat dealing with the pandemic. We saw our politicians working on behalf of Canadians. Were there lessons that you saw in the Canadian response to that you think applies to the huge goal that you've laid down that we need to accomplish through this $2 trillion transition or whatever it's worth?
Oh, there definitely were, and I can think of a couple. I mean, clearly Canadians come together when there's a crisis. We've seen that in 2008. We've seen it before. We saw it with COVID. And the thing that really strikes me, though, is when we decide to come together and do something, and I saw it mostly in Ottawa, all of a sudden we become way more efficient. Decisions get taken. We set a direction. We execute way faster than we would in normal times, in peace times. And so the lesson for me when it comes to any of these priorities that we think are urgent, we need to take that kind of wartime mentality and say we're all in this together. The second lesson is and you know, it's always easy to judge when you're looking back. Hindsight's 20/20. But I think we need to look at how the public sector and the private sector can work together better and help each other through this. And in the work that I did with the G7, when we're thinking about how to make critical supply chains, whether they're health related, whether they're electric vehicle related, computer related, it's clear to us that the ability to secure those supply chains and reinforce them can only happen with governments and the private sector working together. And I think we need to learn how to do that better and do it more often.
Yeah, and we've had examples in the past. You mentioned the War Cabinet. There were times when we had a wage and price control commission that was sort of over top of the economy. So I'm not asking you to advocate for any of that, but I want to thank you for your talk today and setting the stage for all that has to be accomplished.
It was a pleasure. I'm looking forward to the rest of it.
Thanks, Carolyn.